You know, the baptism of Jesus, it's one of the most famous scenes in the entire Bible. But when you really stop and think about it, it's also one of the most confusing. It seems to raise way more questions than it answers. So today, we're going to unpack the mystery behind this incredibly important event. And really, the whole puzzle boils down to this one single cryptic statement. Can you imagine the scene? John the Baptist, the guy doing all the baptizing, is totally stunned. He knows Jesus is the Messiah, and he actually tries to stop him. But Jesus insists, saying, "It is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." What in the world does that mean?
And that's the big one, right? This is the question that has had people scratching their heads for centuries. John's whole ministry was built around a baptism for repentance. So if the cornerstone of Christian belief is that Jesus was perfect, completely without sin, why on earth would he need to do this? It feels like a massive contradiction.
To solve this, we've got to do what any good investigator would do. We have to understand the language of the time. You see, the words repentance and righteousness just didn't mean the same thing to a first-century Jew that they might mean to us today. We have to crack their code.
So let's start with repentance. The Hebrew word is teshuvah. And for them, it wasn't about just feeling bad about something you did. It's an action word. It literally means to return. John was calling the people to turn around and come back to God's law, back to his commandments. The baptism was like a public sign that you were committed to making that turn.
And this next part, this is a huge clue. Their idea of righteousness wasn't some fuzzy, abstract moral quality. For them, it was incredibly concrete. The Psalms flat out say it. All your commandments are righteousness. So, to do righteousness was to obey the commandments. Simple as that.
Okay, so things are getting a little clearer. Jesus wasn't saying, "I'm a sinner." He was telling John, "Hey, we need to do this to fulfill one of God's commands." But that just kicks the can down the road, right? It leads to another mystery. What specific commandment said that the Messiah had to get dunked in the Jordan River? Well, the answer, believe it or not, is tucked away in a part of the Old Testament law that most of us probably skim right through. The key isn't in the 10 Commandments. It's in a super detailed purification ritual all the way back in the book of Numbers. All right, so check this out. This law from Numbers chapter 19 describes this really specific process. First, a red heifer was sacrificed and its ashes were collected. Then you mix those ashes with water to create something called the water of purification. You'd sprinkle this water on anyone who had become ritually unclean. But, and this is the key, look at that final step. After you were sprinkled, you still had to complete the process by washing yourself and your clothes in water. And boom, there it is. That's what was happening. Jesus' baptism in the Jordan was the fulfillment of that final step. It was the personal, complete washing that the law required for ritual purity. He wasn't being baptized for some moral failing. He was perfectly fulfilling this very specific commandment.
Okay, but that brings up another obvious question. If this was an official fulfillment of an Old Testament law, shouldn't he be at the temple in Jerusalem? Why wasn't this done by the official high priest? Why all the way out in the wilderness with John the Baptist?
Well, this is where the politics of the day get really juicy. You kind of had two competing priesthoods at the time. You had Annas and Caiaphas, the guys in charge of the temple. But they were political appointees, basically put there by the Roman government. Then you had John the Baptist. He had the actual priestly bloodline. He was the son of Zechariah from the line of Aaron. And crucially, God had called him directly out in the desert. His authority was from heaven, not from Rome. So you see, in God's eyes, John was the legitimate high priest of that moment. That's why Jesus went to him. He was submitting himself to the true spiritual authority that God had set up, not the corrupt political one in Jerusalem. This was absolutely the right man at the right place, fulfilling the right law.
But this is so much bigger than just Jesus checking a box on an ancient law. This whole physical act was a powerful symbol. It was like a shadow, and it was pointing to a much, much greater spiritual reality.
The book of Hebrews actually makes this exact comparison. It says, hey, if that old ritual, with the ash and the water, could make a person physically clean, just imagine how much more the sacrifice of Christ can do. That first one was temporary, for the purification of the flesh. But what Jesus brought is eternal. It cleanses the conscience. His baptism was the bridge between the two.
The Apostle Paul just drives this point home in the book of Romans. He says that Christ is the telos of the law. Now, that Greek word, telos, it doesn't just mean the end, as in something is terminated. It means the goal, the objective, the whole point of the thing.
Christ didn't come to get rid of the law, he came to be the very thing the law was pointing to all along. So when you put all these pieces together, it's crystal clear. Jesus' baptism had absolutely nothing to do with him admitting to personal sin. It was a profound act of obedience to step into and complete a prophetic picture that God had painted hundreds of years earlier. He was showing everyone that he was the reality that all those Old Testament shadows were hinting at.
So, okay, what's the big takeaway here? Why does untangling this ancient puzzle matter for us today? Well, it completely reframes how we understand Jesus' entire mission.
Jesus said it himself, "I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." And his baptism might be the most powerful example of exactly what he meant. He lived out the law perfectly, not to prove how good he was, but so that the righteousness the law demanded could be fulfilled for us. He didn't just follow the rules, he became the living, breathing purpose behind them. And that changes everything.